hope you've had a nice day. It's been a nice weather again. A little bit colder this morning, but nice weather. So I hope you enjoyed your day. So this is session number 35. And we're going to go through some theory tonight about dive reflexes. And we've mentioned a few of them a few times. And I'd just like to go through some of the deeper physiology behind it. I always say about all these things that knowing this deep theory doesn't make you a better freediver per se, but if you have an understanding of it, then your training you can make a little bit more specific and objective orientated. So that's always good to have that knowledge in the background. Okay, so before I start, just go over last night. We didn't really have much chance. Well, I specifically finished the session after the breathing, because I wanted you to do some breath holds and have some ideas and just make use of that kind of relaxation that you had from the meditation session that Sophie went through. So I didn't want to kind of talk or anything over it, so I left you to it, and hopefully you guys had a nice experience with the meditation, and then maybe kind of a nice breath hold afterwards. And I also asked you to get in your mind's eye some objectives about what you want to do, lockdown freediving, long-term freediving, and maybe just a cheeky one in there just about kind of life in general. Don't get too deep. I didn't really get too deep into it, but just it'll be nice time to kind of reflect on things. So tonight we're going to talk about dive reflexes. Now I mentioned it 3 sessions ago, just on the offhand comment about dive reflexes, and I also mentioned it in regards to the Zany tables. So the Zany tables are specifically designed to develop some of your dive reflexes. Okay, so what do we mean by dive reflexes? Well, there are 6 dive reflexes, which we categorize under dive reflexes. Okay, there's 6 of them. I was going to get a list up, but I didn't do that. Oh well, you just have to take notes. So there are six reflexes in the body which we categorize under dive reflexes, and they are kicked in when we dive. Okay? But there are different stimulus that kick them in. Okay, so we can't train all of them dry, but we can train quite a lot of them dry. And can I just, before we start, mention cold water immersion reflex? Okay, this is not one of the 6 that we're going to talk about. Okay, this is not one of the 6 we're going to talk about, but it is a dive reflex, which is why I'm mentioning it. Okay? And it's cold water immersion reflex. And this is simply if you immerse yourself in cold water and are relaxed, then the body goes into in extreme cases, go into a hibernation state. Okay, and this has been proven that people, usually guys who are drunk or little kids, have fallen into a frozen lake. And there's a reason why it's drunk guys and kids, is because they're not. If you or I were to be walking on a frozen lake and it broke, we would panic, or we'd try and swim, or we'd try and get out, or we'd call for help. Okay, all these activities that we kind of do. Whereas young kids and drunk, I don't know why it's drunk guys, it could be drunk ladies, but it's generally drunk guys, I don't know why. When they fall into ice cold, a frozen lake, and they fall in, they won't panic. Okay, so they kind of allow the cold water immersion reflex to kick in. And the amazing thing is they've sunk underwater and people have been pulled out up to 40 minutes later. Pulled out of the water and they've made a complete recovery. Okay, so this is a super powerful reflex, and it's shown to kind of preserve life in extreme circumstances. So, and they get pulled out of the water 10 minutes, half hour, up to 40 minutes later. So they've been underwater for 40 minutes, and as long as they're warmed up gently, they might have a little bit of hypothermia, but they do make a complete recovery. Okay, so this is cold water immersion reflex. Now, I've not included it in the 6 we're going to look at, but Aaron Solomon did give me a good example of how you could use the cold water immersion reflex as a training system in freediving. Now, some of the other dive reflexes, the 6 we're going to look at, some of them you cannot train when you're over a certain age. Maybe 40, maybe 50, something like this. Okay, when you're over 40, you can't train them. They're too ingrained in your subconscious, and you can't train them. This is according to Aaron, and if he says it's true, I'm inclined to believe him. Okay, so he had a guy come to him who wanted to learn to freedive at 50 years old. Learn, so that's start at 50. That's not freediving when they're 50, but started learning at 50. And they really wanted to train hard, and they wanted to train the dive reflexes. And he said, well, you can't train the dive reflexes, but what you can do is use the cold water immersion reflex. How do you do that? And he got this guy to ice cold bowl of water, hold his breath, put his face in the water, and relax completely. Only do short hold, 30 seconds, a minute or so, and allow the cold water immersion reflex to kick in. And then slowly, over a period of months, got that water from ice cold up to 15 degrees or so, which is cold water in England, or cold water diving in England. But warm water for England, but cold. So training the body that they wanted the cold water immersion reflex to kick in, okay, which remember is super powerful, okay, can make people survive underwater for 40 minutes, but then raise the temperature up and try and keep the body remembering it's the cold water immersion reflex you want to kick in. And apparently it worked. So that's a little bit of an aside. Aaron Solomon kind of went through that. But we're not going to study that tonight. Okay. We're going to look at 6 other dive reflexes. Okay, so the first one we talk about is bradycardia. Okay, so bradycardia is the lowering of the heart rate. Okay, so it's the lowering of heart rate, and it's a medical term, bradycardia, and you can see here, so normal heartbeat on the left, and on the right you've got bradycardia, and it's literally the same shape, it's the same pattern, so the heart is beating normal, so it's a normal rhythm, or normal profile, just slowed down. Okay, so the top 2 diagrams are just for interest's sake, we're not going to go into too much about that. So the heartbeat will just slow down. This is called bradycardia. Now, this can be brought on by different things. If you were to exercise and the heart rate goes up, and then sit down quietly, close your eyes and relax, the heart rate will drop. This is not bradycardia, the heart rate is slowing down, but it's slowing down in response to not needing to be fast. Okay, but that's not bradycardia in what we're talking about. What we're talking about is telling the body to slow the heart rate, but not just by sitting quietly, but actually the action of slowing the heart rate. Okay. Now, this comes in very easily. The body quite naturally lowers the heart rate when we hold our breath. So somebody who's been training a short while, but not particularly in depth in their training, they'll have bradycardia, which is why the Zany tables are so important, because the Zany tables are a series of breath holds, empty lung breath holds, where we keep the heart rate high. So the first thing the body tries to do is lower the heart rate, bradycardia, but it can't do it, so so it has to do something else. It does one of the other 6, or the other 5, because we're talking, there's 6 of them in total. Okay. The other thing is we can train as freedivers to increase bradycardia in effect. Okay, so generally, an untrained bradycardia will maybe drop 25%. While on trained freedivers, it can drop to half. Okay, and usually it's triggered either by CO2, okay, or with cold water, or water on the face. Okay, cold water immersion reflex, which I mentioned ago, influences it big time. Okay, the cold water immersion reflex triggers bradycardia as well. Okay, if that makes sense. Okay, so if you imagine 60 beats per minute, and if you're trained, you can get that bradycardia to come down to half and get down to 30 beats per minute. So it's quite a powerful effect. Okay, so that's the first one we're going to talk about, or we've talked about. The second one is peripheral vasoconstriction. Okay, so peripheral means the edges, the extremities of the body. So we're talking about the fingertips, the toes, the ends of the nose, okay, and vasoconstriction. So we're talking about the constriction of the blood vessels, okay, vascular constriction. Okay, now, so in the middle here we have a normal artery, okay, and then on the right hand side we have a constricted artery. Okay, so this is vasoconstriction. This is what happens. Okay, so peripheral vasoconstriction, it means it's happening at the extremities of the body. Okay, so we don't need the idea behind it is when we hold our breath, and we've taught the body what we're going to do when we hold our breath. The body knows it doesn't need lots of blood to the fingertips because we're not doing anything dexterous. Okay, we don't need blood to the tips of the nose or the toes because we're not going to use them particularly in what we're going to do. So vasoconstriction happens. So there's less blood goes to the fingertips and the hands and the nose and the feet and the extremities. Okay? So this is vasoconstriction. It means we save oxygen, okay, to be used in the organs that we are going to use, okay, whether they're muscles for movement or the heart and the brain to kind of stay alive. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, we've also got dilated on this diagram here. We've got a dilated artery. Now, when we breathe through our nose, okay, I'll mention this in the foundation course, okay. One of the reasons we want to breathe through the nose is because in the sinuses, the body generates nitric oxide, okay, which causes vasodilation. Okay, so the arteries are dilating, allowing blood to flow. Okay? So this is one of the reasons why we breathe through the nose, because it allows lots of blood to flow around the body. Now, before a dive, we want this to happen. Okay, we want the body to be fully oxygenated, because if the fingertips are fully oxygenated before the dive, when we do the dive, the body can vasoconstrict and stop blood going to the fingertips because there's got plenty of oxygen there. It's not going to use it because it's not doing much. Okay, and it's got plenty because before the dive we had dilated arteries. Okay, does that make sense? Hopefully it makes sense. Okay, so that's two of the 6 we're going to talk about. The next one, super simple. Okay, the spleen effect. Okay, so the spleen is an organ, sits next to the stomach. Okay, it's about 4 inches long or so, and it stores oxygen, red blood cells. Sorry. Okay, it stores red blood cells. Okay. A high volume of red blood cells. So as soon as we need it, want it, the blood, the spleen will squish and release those red blood cells into the body. Okay, so this is something that happens when you hold your breath. And a trained freediver, I've been in a trial where they ultrasound and measured the size of your spleen, did a warm up and then a breath hold, and then the spleen squeezed down and you have more red blood cells. Okay. Now, there is a school of thought that these effects that we're talking about, these dive reflexes, aren't developed in the body, through evolution to help us dive, but just help us survive. Okay, and this is, they're very, 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 very similar kind of results, but the school of thoughts are quite different. So, for instance, the spleen effect, apparently, it holds the red blood cells in case there's an emergency. You've got major trauma, you're losing blood and serious bleeding, and I need more blood because I've lost a whole load. Okay, so the spleen can kind of release its red blood cells and kind of keep you alive. Okay, and that's true, it does. So that's a kind of survival argument that people come up with. But if you read the aquatic ape theory, I haven't got a copy to hand actually. Maybe I'll dig it out for tomorrow. Again, a great book. I'm looking on my bookshelf. I can't see it to grab it to tell you who it's by. But anyway, the aquatic ape theory. They suggest that all these dive reflexes were there as an evolutionary advantage when we were hunter-gatherers. And you imagine if you've got a village and you're on the side of on the seaside or on a river, if you can dive, if you can hold your breath, if you can swim better than the other people, you're going to survive better than the other people. Okay, so these are evolutionary traits that helped us dive. Okay? So the aquatic ape theory, also the fact that we're hairless, and only diving mammals are hairless. Mostly a few of the pachyderms, but most of those even spend quite a lot of time in water. Hippopotamus and stuff. Okay, so two schools of thought. Are these for evolutionary advantage or are these survival? Still by evolutionary advantage. Like if you survived more dramatic trauma, then than other people, you're going to survive. So they're still evolutionary, and they kind of go hand in hand. Okay, so we've done three of our 6. Okay, so we've done peripheral vasoconstriction. Okay, so let's get back to my picture. So we've done, we started with bradycardia, so the slowing of the heart rate, and in a trained freediver, it can go down by half. Peripheral vasoconstriction, so the blood vessels in the extremities of the body constrict down. The spleen effect, so the spleen squishes and releases its red blood cells into the body. Thanks, Darren. just checked. Just saw there. Darren says the sea nomads have been shown to have larger spleens. Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about is the blood shift. Okay. So, yeah. Okay. So, problem with blood shift and vasoconstriction are they both move blood around the body. So they are two different effects, and you've got to be really sure of which one you're talking about. But in normal parlance, people will interchange blood shift and vasoconstriction quite often, but they are completely different. Okay. So the lungs, if you imagine the lungs are full of air, like a balloon, okay, but different from a balloon. On the outside of the balloon, you've got blood vessels, okay, that are supplying oxygen to the lungs. Okay, this isn't the blood vessels inside the lungs that are supplying oxygen. Taking oxygen out of the lungs and then putting it around the body. These are the blood vessels which are actually supplying the lungs themselves with oxygen. Okay. Now, if you imagine this balloon is very fine, kind of rubber membrane, and you've got these blood vessels on the outside. As we go into the water, okay, and start diving, okay, what can happen, okay, is these blood vessels on the outside of the lungs can get engorged with blood. Okay, so if you imagine this balloon, fine layer of rubber, this fine layer of rubber, it gets engorged with blood, so it's a thicker layer of rubber. So there's less air inside. Okay? And this actually allows the body to go deeper, okay, because the lungs aren't, then compressed because they're full of blood, so the chest doesn't collapse. And this was in the Big Blue. The history of it is not quite as in the Big Blue, but somebody said to Jacques Mayol, "If you do that, you'll die." And this is because they'd built a chest with some lungs, and they put it in water, and they went to 50 meters. I think originally it was past 30 meters, and this rib cage collapsed. And they were, you're going to die if you go past 30 meters. And then people went past 30 meters, and they went, a little bit of flexibility. We didn't take that into account. And I believe it was Enzo Mallorca who they said, well, if you go past 50 meters, you're absolutely definitely dead. And he did. And this is because of blood shift. Okay, so the blood vessels on the outside of the lungs get engorged with blood, so that the skin, as it were, of the lungs get thicker. Okay. Be very careful. Some people, due to a documentary in early noughties, okay, they suggested, somebody said the lungs fill up with blood. Okay. They don't fill up with blood. The lungs, the air pockets that we breathe air into, do not fill with blood. Okay, but the outside gets engorged with blood. And there was this documentary that went out that said the lungs fill with blood. Loads of people misunderstood it, and so you still see it on the internet. Free divers are crazy. When they dive deep, their lungs fill up with blood. They don't. And there was an interview with Tanya Streeter, and they said when she did 150 meters no limits, 160 meters no limits dive, I said, how does it feel when your lungs fill up with blood? And she just kind of went, I don't really know. You don't really feel it. She was a little bit taken aback because it was just this kind of common misconception. It doesn't happen. Okay. So, if you want the technical words for it, what happens, okay, is the residual volume of your lungs gets less, okay, because the walls of the lungs get thicker. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Just a glass of water here. Yeah. Okay, now this blood shift is one of the dive reflexes that we can't train dry because it comes in due to pressure. Okay. Now we've got a couple of exercises that we can do that can kick it in. Okay. So for instance, if you were to be diving, doing particularly deep series of dives, if you did say 2 dives to reasonably deep, you go the first time, you come back up, the body goes, you want to dive deep, and it starts pumping the blood, creating blood shift, and then the second dive you do, blood shift's already there, so it's easier to go deep. Okay, it does come off later. You come back up, and when you ascend, a little bit of blood comes out, but the body's trying to compensate for something you're doing, so it doesn't go straight back to thin-walled lungs, as it were. The lungs that don't go thin straight away. It takes maybe 20 minutes or so. So we do have some exercises in no tanks where if you're going to dive deep, you can switch on the blood shift maybe 10 minutes before your main dive. Okay, you can switch it on so the blood starts shifting and engorging the outside of the lungs before you dive. So you don't have to do a deep dive to trigger it. Okay, you can do a deep dive to trigger it, but there's exercises means you don't have to do a deep dive to trigger it. And this makes sense because you don't want to do a deep dive before a deep dive. Okay, it's just going to be tiring on the body. Okay, and yes, there you go. So this obviously stops barotrauma as there's less air to start with. So if there's this much air and it squishes down to this, it's going to be a much less movement required for the chest than if it comes up to this, down to this, then that's a big movement. Okay. So that's why we have that. So this is blood shift. Now let me go back. I've got my list written down here. So tick them off. So we did bradycardia, peripheral vasoconstriction, spleen effect, blood shift, hemocompensation, blood shift, and hypometabolism. Okay, so hypo and hyper. Hypo is lowering, okay, and hyper is going up. Okay, so hypometabolism, metabolism starts dropping down. Okay, and this is one of the effects that we can train. As soon as the metabolism starts dropping down, the body compensates by doing other things. For instance, in the zany tables, the brain starts working more efficiently. Both half works together, and our brain focuses on one thing. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so that's that's hypometabolism, slowing of the body's metabolism. Metabolism happens every single cell using oxygen, and it just uses it slower, so that allows the heart rate to drop, allows other things to happen. Okay, so I've got a couple of comments. Having trouble with my thumbs. That's cool. It's amazing that we've gone past 150 meters. So what about deep water blackout on the ascent? Okay, so we don't really go into blackouts. Wasn't going to go into blackouts tonight. Oh, it's 8 o'clock. I've missed the clapping. I've overshot. I'm really sorry. Guys. Okay, so you blackouts happen when you hold your breath too long. That's it. There is no other reason for a blackout. Okay, so when people talk about shallow water blackouts, and you will see quite a lot of stuff on the internet where people talk about how the change in pressure causes a blackout and blah 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 blah. It's true. The change in pressure in the last section of the dive can bring on the blackout suddenly, but it's still that they hold their breath too long. It doesn't matter. It's because you have to come through that last 10 meters of the water. So we've got to go through that change. It's not like, oh no, I don't want to have a shallow water blackout. I'll stop at 10 meters. You can't. because there's no air there. So blackouts are always you've held your breath too long. Okay? That's it, black and white. If you're working hard and you're using up oxygen, okay, people say, yeah, but I worked too hard. I didn't hold my breath too long. Yeah, you did. You worked too hard for how long you held your breath. You held your breath too long. Okay? And most blackouts, even shallow water blackouts, happen at the end of the dive purely because that's where you've held your breath the longest, and that's always going to be in the shallow part of the dive. Okay? Deep water blackouts, held your breath too long. Yeah, you've done some weird stuff down there, body didn't like it, panicked, heart rate got up. Okay. So just a little question there by Ted. Cheers. Okay, so that's I'm really sorry about missing the clapping, guys, really sorry. Okay, so that's 5 of the dive reflexes. You can pause it now and go and clap and then come back and watch it. It'll be up. I'll put it up straight away, honest. Okay, so that's 5. The last one I'm going to talk about is Immersion Diuresis. Okay, basically you want to pee. Okay, now there are several reasons why this happens. Okay, the most prevalent will be because when you're in water, when you stand up rather, the water in your body kind of sinks towards your feet. As soon as you get in water, effectively you're weightless with regards to blood, because blood is the same weight as water roughly. Okay, so the fluid that usually would be in your feet is kind of floating around your chest. Body senses it and goes, "Oh, you got too much fluid. Get rid of some." Okay, so you start wanting to wee. So that doesn't matter whether you're swimming, diving, freediving. Okay, but it is also peripheral vasoconstriction aids this as well. So when you're holding your breath, you tend to get there as well. Okay, so the two come together when you're diving. That's it. Okay, so hopefully that's covered everything you want to know about dive reflexes. Remember, they are triggered by various things: CO2, immersion in water, rising pressure, low temperature if you're talking about the cold water. But equally well, your body can trigger them as an autonomic response. Okay? So if you learn freediving correctly, every time you hold your breath, you do some sort of conditional hook, some sort of movement or activity before you hold your breath. You're teaching your body, like a Pavlovian response, I want you to do the dive reflexes now. That's before the dive. Okay? So you can kick all of them in. Okay, apart from the blood shift, you can kick them all in before the dive. Okay, the way you train it is the zany tables. So hopefully that's gone through. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Any questions, put them in the messages. As always, I'll leave this up for a little while, and we'll see you tomorrow for number 36. Again, if you want anything covered next week, let me know. Send me a messenger. Let me know, and I'll try and cover it next week. Okay, so thanks a lot, and see you tomorrow.